Alright, so if you're watching this, I'm assuming you either missed class or you just want a quick refresher. If you were in class, you might be able to jump ahead a little bit in this video, but what we're talking about right now is taxes. As we saw earlier in the semester, when you have a tax, the tax has an effect not on the demand curve, because ultimately consumers only really care about the final cost of a good or service. The effect is then on the supply curve. It's kind of like an input cost on the supply. So in our example here, and we're going to do this for, we're going to look at then how that shift has an effect on both suppliers and consumers for elastic or inelastic good. Because just because it moves the supply curve doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on consumers. It just means that the actual demand schedule isn't being changed. So in our case, we're looking at grebes, and we're looking at what would happen if there was a 15-cent tax per grebe added in order to raise revenue for higher education. So we have a supply schedule here. At 50 million grebes, or sorry, at 10 cents, suppliers are willing to supply 50 million grebes. At 15 cents, they might be a little bit less efficient at it, but if they can get 15 cents, it's profitable enough to produce even more of them. At 20 cents, same thing, it's even profitable to produce even more grebes, and so on. Now, if we added a tax to the grebe of 15 cents, so say we had a price of 25 cents per grebe, in effect, sellers are actually only going to get 10 cents, because 15 of it goes to the government, and so they're still only going to supply 50 million of them. At 30 cents, suppliers actually get 15 cents, so they're going to supply 100 million, and we could go so on up 35, 40, 45, and 50 cents. And if we graph that, it's going to look like this. Let's see if I can draw a straight line here. And so that is our new supply curve. Notice it's kind of a shift up, but it's actually a decrease in supply. And it really is a shift up by the amount of the added input cost, the tax. So then if we're going to use that same tax in all of these, let's look at how this is going to affect, first of all, a relatively inelastic demand for grebes. So we'll start with, actually before there's a tax. The first 4 questions are always the same on these, and we'll start before there's a tax and see what the effect is, or what the equilibrium prices and quantities are. So the equilibrium quantity, we can see where the equilibrium is, and the equilibrium quantity then is that 200. And if we look at the equilibrium price, just kind of follow that over, we'll see that it's 25 cents. So if buyers are spending 25 cents per grebe times 200 million grebes, they're spending a total of 50 million on grebes. And because the sellers are actually receiving all of that money, none of it's going to the government yet, they receive all 50 million. Then we should go ahead and draw in our adjusted supply curve for after the tax.
Please meet Julia Kessel in the office. Marta Siegfried, please meet Julia Kessel in the office.
There you go, Marta Siegfried, meet Julia whatever in the office. Alright, there was our supply curve after the 15-cent tax, and as you see, we get a new equilibrium spot with a new equilibrium quantity and a new equilibrium price. Now, if the government adds a tax, it might be tempting to think that the suppliers would just pass the tax on to the consumers. However, it doesn't quite work that way, because if the suppliers try to just pass all the cost on and try to still sell 200 million of them at 40 cents, the demand just isn't going to be there. And so suppliers are going to have to cut back their supply, how many they're supplying, and prices are going to get driven down because there will have been a surplus. So those are our new equilibrium prices and quantities. So now let's look at question number 5. The new equilibrium quantity we saw above was 150 million, and that new equilibrium price was 35 cents. The new equilibrium price received by sellers then is that 35 cents minus the 15 cents that is going to the government. So sellers actually only receive 20 cents. Buyers are spending 35 cents per grebe times the 150 million grebes that they're buying. If you punch that into your calculator, you should get 52.5 million grebes. And sellers, after the tax, they're receiving 20 cents per grebe times the 150 million grebes, so they're receiving 30 million. The government revenue from this tax would be 15 cents per grebe times the 150 million, which is 22.5 million if you plug it into a calculator. And now G, H, and I are the ones that get a little bit confusing. Hopefully those first 5 are pretty straightforward. In letter G, it asks how much of this revenue, this 22.5 million, is paid by buyers in the form of higher prices. So to figure that out, let's look at 2 things. How much were buyers paying before the tax? 25 cents. And how much are they paying now after the tax? Which is 35 cents. In other words, sellers passed on 10 cents of the tax to the buyers. So buyers are spending 10 cents more times the 150 million that they are that they're buying. So they are spending, essentially covering 15 million of that tax. Sellers, if we look at them, before the tax they received 25 cents. They received all of it. Now after the tax they're actually only receiving 20 cents. So they've lost 5 cents per grebe that they've sold. So 5 cents per grebe times the 150 million grebes that they're selling, and you'll find that that's 7.5 million. Obviously these two numbers, H, G, and H, should add up to your total in F. Then lastly, and then I'm going to leave it here, lastly is this uncollected revenue lost. Before the tax, sellers were able to sell 200 million. Now they only sell 150 million. And so they've lost revenue not just because they're essentially paying part of the tax, they've also lost some revenue because they are not selling these 50 million grebes anymore. So they lost 50 million grebes that they used to sell. That area there represents that uncollected revenue lost. So we could calculate that as 25 cents times 50 million, or perhaps a better way to think about it is to say, look, before the tax, sellers, before the tax, sellers received 50 million. After the tax, sellers are actually only getting 30 million. So they lost $20 million in revenue. Part of the reason they lost revenue was because they're paying part of the tax. They ate part of that cost. The rest of it, that other 12.5 million, is our answer to I. It's the reason it's the uncollected revenue loss that we had. As I said before, you could also calculate it kind of as the area of this rectangle up here, as 50 million times the 25 cents that they used to get per grebe, and you'd get the same thing if you did 0.25, our old price, times the 50 million grebes that we aren't selling anymore. That also equals 12.5 million. So two different ways to come up with the answer to letter I. As you can see, obviously in relatively inelastic demand, most of the cost is borne by the buyers in the form of higher prices, but sellers still lose some income as well. In the rest of this worksheet, in class we did relatively elastic demand, so I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to go over that right now, and I'm not going to ask you to turn that in. But what you'll find when you do relatively elastic demand is ultimately that most of it is going to be borne by the sellers at this point, because our new equilibrium price is only going to be 30 cents, so they effectively only pass on 5 cents of the cost. And you'll find that the uncollected revenue lost is much larger for something that's relatively elastic. Your job is to finish this, do parts C and D, which is for perfectly inelastic demand, and what you'll see there, if you do it correctly, is that if it's perfectly inelastic, it makes sense for sellers just to pass on the entire cost because people are going to buy it anyways. And you'll see then in perfectly elastic demand that it really hurts the sellers because if they try to raise the price, they can't really. Buyers won't buy anything because it's perfectly elastic. And so the new equilibrium price will be the same as it used to be. And in fact, the sellers are going to lose a lot of money because they are going to not only have to eat the entire cost of the tax, but they're going to have a lot less that they're going to sell, so that uncollected revenue lost is going to be very, very large. Once you've finished part C and D, I'd like you to answer just simply questions 1, 2, and 3 of part E. Don't worry about any of the rest of the sheet, but this kind of gets at the heart of the matter here. How do taxes actually affect buyers and sellers? Not just how does it affect the supply curve, but how does it actually impact the consumer and the producer of goods and services?